something has gone catastrophically wrong at the very top of the Iranian regime, and it is happening right now in real time while the entire world watches and struggles to process what it is seeing. Not a political crisis in the conventional sense, not a diplomatic standoff that can be managed through back channels and carefully worded statements, but something far more unsettling, far more dangerous, and far more consequential than anything analysts had prepared for when they mapped out the possible trajectories of this conflict. The man appointed to lead Iran, the man chosen to sit at the absolute apex of one of the most militarized, ideologically rigid, nuclear-capable states on Earth, is lying unconscious in a Tehran hospital right now. He doesn't know he was appointed. He doesn't know that the regime he was chosen to lead is consuming itself from within. He cannot respond to the crisis. He cannot issue orders. He cannot arbitrate between the factions tearing the government apart in the corridors above his hospital bed. Mojtaba Khamenei, named Iran's third supreme leader just weeks ago, is in intensive care, and the power vacuum his condition has created is feeding something that Washington, Beijing, and Moscow all failed to fully anticipate. Iran's own president publicly demanded that the Strait of Hormuz be reopened. Iran's own foreign minister announced to the world that the strait was open to all commercial vessels. And on that exact same day, the IRGC opened fire on tankers. The same regime, the same day, two completely contradictory orders executed simultaneously by different arms of the same government. And then in a moment of almost surreal institutional breakdown, state television called the foreign minister stupid publicly on air in front of the entire nation. What is unfolding inside Iran is not a government under pressure. It is a government that has stopped functioning as a single coherent entity. Three factions operating on three separate agendas, issuing three conflicting sets of orders from what is supposed to be a unified chain of command. And at the top of that chain, where the final word is supposed to come from, there is only silence. A man who cannot open his eyes. This is the moment everything converges, the blockade tightening from outside, the collapse accelerating from within, the deadline at the door, and four men who have despised each other since 1988, now fighting for control of a nuclear-armed state, with every major power on Earth watching from a calculated distance. What is fracturing in Tehran is more dangerous and more consequential than anything happening on the surface of the Strait of Hormuz. And to understand the depth of what is breaking, you have to understand what Iran looked like before it began. The Islamic Republic was always built around competing power centers: the presidency, the supreme leader, the IRGC, the parliament, the guardian council, each institution carrying its own agenda, its own interpretation of the revolution's mandate, its own claim to authority. That complexity was always there, but for decades it was managed by one single thing: the unquestioned supremacy of the supreme leader's office as the final arbiter of every decision that mattered. Ali Khamenei held that position for more than 3 decades. Whatever tension simmered beneath his authority, whatever institutional rivalries competed for influence, his presence at the apex created a gravitational center around which everything else organized itself. When factions collided, there was a court of last resort. When competing agendas threatened open conflict, there was a figure capable of imposing a resolution all parties were compelled to accept. On February 28, that figure ceased to exist. A joint U.S.-Israeli strike eliminated Khamenei, along with IRGC Commander Pakpour, Armed Forces Chief Mousavi, Defense Minister Nasir Zadeh, and 48 senior officials in a single coordinated operation. The command architecture of the Islamic Republic, built over 45 years to concentrate final authority in one ideological hierarchy, was decapitated in a single strike. Mojtaba Khamenei was appointed as the third supreme leader on March 9th. He was meant to fill the vacuum before it could be exploited. He was meant to give the surviving factions a new gravitational center to organize around. He went into a coma shortly after the appointment. The control center of a regime possessing nuclear capabilities was left empty. 4 men moved into that vacuum simultaneously. They were raised in the same IRGC barracks in the 1980s. They were tempered in the same war. They carry 4 decades of accumulated grievances and competing ambitions. Their names are Vahidi, Ghalibaf, Zulgadar, and Rezai. Understanding who they are is essential to understanding why Iran cannot speak with a single voice and why every signal the regime sends to the outside world is immediately contradicted by a different arm of the same government. Ahmad Vahidi is the most dangerous name on that list, and the danger is not abstract. He commanded the Quds Force from 1988 to 1997 before Soleimani. His operational history stretches from Lebanon to Argentina, including command responsibility for the 1994 bombing of the Buenos Aires Jewish Community Center that killed 85 people. He carries an Interpol notice that has followed him for 3 decades. Vahidi was appointed IRGC commander on March 1st, and his worldview is not complicated. The war must continue, the strait must stay closed, negotiations with the United States must be rejected, but what drives that worldview is not purely ideological, it is institutional. The IRGC's budget, its political influence, its claim to relevance all depend on the existence of active external conflict. In wartime, the IRGC is indispensable. In peacetime, everything it built becomes a question. The massive budget becomes politically indefensible in a shattered economy. The proxy networks across the region become diplomatic liabilities. The internal security apparatus becomes an instrument of repression that an exhausted population no longer accepts in silence. For Vahidi, peace is an existential threat to the institution he commands. It is the scenario in which 85 million people ask out loud what 4 decades of sacrifice were actually for. Mohammed Bagher Ghalibaf sits at the opposite end of the practical calculation. As parliament speaker and head of the Islamabad negotiation delegation, Ghalibaf has arrived at a conclusion Vahidi treats as pure betrayal. The economic reality Iran is living inside is unsurvivable. Iran is absorbing $270 billion in war damage. The currency has collapsed to its lowest historical point. Infrastructure has been devastated from Isfahan's industrial zones to the port facilities at Bushehr and Bandar Abbas. The oil storage tanks are full. The wells are approaching forced shutdown with nowhere to sell. Ghalibaf is not a reformist. He is a regime survivor who has calculated that the only path to regime survival runs through negotiation and a deal that stops the bleeding before nothing is left to save. The distinction analysts have drawn is this: he appears to be taking the people's side. He is actually trying to save the regime by positioning it alongside the people's demands rather than against them. Foreign Minister Araghchi sits in the same negotiating camp, announcing publicly that Hormuz was open on April 17th, attempting to signal de-escalation to international partners. He was called stupid on national television by his own military's media the same day. And Pezeshkian, the reformist president elected on a platform of economic relief, dropped a public statement that landed inside the regime like a detonation. He acknowledged that if the conflict continued, Iran faced a reconstruction crisis with no funding and infrastructure in ruins. He said the people must be told the truth. He said trust in government was eroding. For the hardliners, this was surrender. For ordinary Iranians, it was the first honest statement from inside the regime in years. Here's what makes the collision between these factions more explosive than any previous internal dispute. For the first time since the revolution, a faction of the regime is publicly saying what the Iranian people have been saying for years, and the people's patience ran out long before this crisis arrived. Iran's state television claimed 87% of Iranians support continuing the war. The host delivered this figure with absolute conviction. No polling organization was named, no methodology described, no data source cited. The 87% was presented as established fact in the way only figures invented for political purposes can be delivered with total confidence. The reality, measured by the independent Gaman Research Institute in a survey of over 30,000 participants, sits at the precise opposite. 63% of Iranians say the war is between the regime and Israel and has nothing to do with the Iranian people. 44% hold the regime directly responsible for the country's condition. 58% rate the regime's performance negatively. The distance between 87% claim war support and 63% regime non-identification is not a polling discrepancy. It is the documented measurement of a regime that has lost contact with the population it claims to represent. That gap has been widening since Mahsa Amini's death in 2022 set off protest waves that nearly destabilized the entire system. Gamma On's trend data shows the direction of public opinion inside Iran accelerating toward regime change. Not organized revolution necessarily, but a sustained erosion of perceived legitimacy approaching the point where propaganda alone cannot contain it. Ghalibaf and Pezeshkian understand this. Their alignment with the people is the political equivalent of a structural engineer watching the foundation crack and recommending evacuation before the building collapses on everyone inside. Vahidi either doesn't see it or has decided it doesn't matter because his calculation does not include regime survival as a terminal value. It includes IRGC survival, and those are not the same thing. Into this fractured landscape, two massive external pressures are arriving simultaneously and accelerating every tension toward a breaking point. The first is the Hormuz trap closing tighter by the day. Before the U.S. blockade, Iran was exporting 1,850,000 barrels of oil per day, almost entirely to China, generating approximately $150 million in daily revenue. That revenue funded soldier salaries, government operations, proxy network financing across the region. That revenue is now zero. The oil being produced has nowhere to go. Storage capacity is filling. According to Ruda, Iran has a window of 10 to 15 days before it must begin shutting down oil wells entirely. Oil well shutdown is not a reversible administrative decision. It is a geological event with permanent consequences. When underground pressure is released by well closure, reservoir damage accumulates that can permanently reduce production capacity. Some wells, once shut down under these conditions, cannot be fully restored. Every day the blockade holds, Iran's long-term production capacity is being permanently reduced. Trump stated on Truth Social that Iran is losing $500 million per day. The IMF is signaling global economic slowdown. And the strait itself has become a physical manifestation of the regime's incoherence. Iran's foreign minister announces it opened the IRGC fires on ships. Iran opens the strait briefly for 5 cruise ships, then closes it again. Every country watching draws the same conclusion. Iran has lost the ability to execute any coherent strategy. It can neither fight its way out nor negotiate its way out. Hormuz was Iran's ultimate strategic weapon for 4 decades. It has become Iran's cage. The second external pressure is perhaps the most diplomatically stunning development in this entire crisis because it is not coming from Washington or Tel Aviv. It is coming from Beijing and Moscow. Xi Jinping called Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and explicitly stated that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to normal passage. Read that choice carefully. China's leader called Saudi Arabia, not Iran, to deliver this position, not his declared ally of 25 years, not the country with which China signed a comprehensive strategic partnership promising hundreds of billions in investment. The signal embedded in that choice is surgical. China is telling the region that its priority is the waterway, not the Islamic Republic. Before the blockade, China purchased 90% of Iran's oil exports. Now China publicly pressures its own supplier to stand down because Chinese ships were being fired on while simultaneously being seized by American forces. China is indirectly strengthening Ghalibaf and Pezeshkian, not out of sympathy for the reformist wing, but because China's energy security and Gulf commercial interests all point toward negotiation as the only acceptable outcome. Vahidi's war policy is directly threatening Chinese economic interests, and Beijing has stopped being quiet about it. Russia's position is simultaneously more complex and more cynical. Lavrov appeared at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, condemned the U.S. blockade as unlawful, and then said something that stripped the performance of all ambiguity. Russia is ready to supply energy resources to China and other countries affected by the crisis. There it is. Russia is performing solidarity with Iran while advertising its readiness to replace Iran in the markets Iran is losing. Every barrel of Iranian oil that cannot reach China is a barrel Russia can sell at a premium Iran can no longer contest. Russia benefits from every day the blockade holds. The result is that Iran, at its most vulnerable moment in decades, has achieved a geopolitical isolation that even its most determined enemies could not have engineered alone. China is watching from the Gulf side. Russia is preparing to fill the markets Iran is losing. The IRGC's proxy network is collapsing. Hezbollah's senior leadership has been eliminated. Hamas has been crushed in Gaza. The Houthis are in direct naval combat with American forces. The foundations of Iranian regional influence are eroding from every direction at once. At the center of the storm stands a detail that makes everything more dangerous than any external pressure alone. The figure who would normally arbitrate between these factions, whose approval Ghalibaf is constitutionally required to obtain before making any strategic decision, is in intensive care and cannot communicate. Every position the Islamabad delegation advances, every concession attached to the nuclear talks is being made on the claimed authority of a coma patient who has no knowledge of what is being done in his name. The approval is imaginary. The mandate is invented. The constitutional architecture through which supreme leader authority channels downward is operating on the legal fiction that Mojtaba Khamenei is aware of and endorsing decisions made in his name. For Vahidi, this fiction creates something more useful than a political argument. It creates a perpetual veto mechanism. Every decision Ghalibaf claims authorization for is challengeable. Every concession the negotiating team makes can be declared unauthorized and void. Every agreement Araghchi signs can be repudiated by the IRGC on the grounds that no legitimate supreme leader approval was obtained. The coma is not merely a leadership vacuum. In Vahidi's hands, it is a retroactive cancellation device deployable against any outcome the hardliners dislike. The historical parallel analysts are drawing carefully and with full awareness of its implications is Moscow in 1924. After Lenin's death, old comrades who had fought the same revolution began settling personal scores under the guise of ideological succession. The stated framework was the revolution's future. The actual framework was accumulated grievances between men who had competed for the same promotions and filed charges against each other for decades. Vahidi failed at Kermanshah in 1988. Rezai filed the charges, military police made an arrest, Ghalibaf commanded one of those corps. Zolgadar, now Secretary General of the Supreme National Security Council, was once Vahidi's superior. The institutional roles have reversed, the personal grievances have not. What is playing out in Tehran is not a Politburo making rational calculations about national interest. It is, as one analyst put it with devastating precision, a nuclear-armed high school reunion. And the personal scores being settled inside that reunion are determining whether Iran negotiates its way through this crisis or escalates into something the region cannot contain. The deadline has arrived. Vice President Vance has traveled to Islamabad. The second round of nuclear talk is theoretically scheduled. Iran has not confirmed whether it intends to participate. Inside Tehran, the decision is not being made by a unified government analyzing its options and selecting the most rational path forward. It is being violently contested between a president who publicly acknowledged the war has become unsurvivable, a parliament speaker who wants to negotiate while watching for the knife Vahidi is sharpening, a foreign minister called stupid on national television by his own side, a comatose supreme leader whose approval is constitutionally required but physically impossible to obtain, and an IRGC commander who views any deal as the beginning of the irreversible end of everything his institution built. These four men have known each other since 1988. They know each other's weaknesses, past failures, and present vulnerabilities. They are playing the final hand of a 40-year competition with stakes set at the survival of a regime, the welfare of 85 million people, and the stability of the most strategically critical waterway on Earth. Ghalibaf is calculating whether he can move against Vahidi through the assembly of experts before Vahidi neutralizes him first. Vahidi is calculating whether the next tanker he fires on destroys the negotiating faction's credibility inside the regime entirely. Pezeshkian is calculating whether honesty with the public buys the regime enough legitimacy to survive, or whether that honesty accelerates the collapse he is trying to prevent. And the Iranian people, 63% of whom told independent researchers this war has nothing to do with them, are asking the one question no faction has a comfortable answer to. How much longer? The oil wells have 10 to 15 days. The storage tanks are full. The deadline has passed. China is watching from the Gulf side. Russia is preparing to fill the markets. Iran is losing. 85 million Iranians are watching regime propaganda claim 87% war support while knowing in their bones that 63% of their neighbors say this war was never theirs to begin with. The Strait opened for 5 cruise ships and closed again before the signal could mean anything. And the man who is supposed to make the final decision cannot open his eyes. If Ghalibaf's faction can consolidate enough authority to keep the Islamabad talks alive, if Araghchi can survive long enough to deliver a framework, if the IRGC's sabotage campaign can be contained, there is a path to a deal. Not an elegant deal, but a deal that stops the oil clock before the wells go permanently dark. That provides enough economic relief to prevent the domestic uprising Ghalibaf can already see building, and that gives every side just enough to claim survival. If Vahidi wins the internal war, if he neutralizes Ghalibaf before a second round of talks produces momentum, if the IRGC reasserts its monopoly on war-making authority over the civilian faction survival calculation, the alternative path leads somewhere no one is prepared for. Escalation that no single actor fully controls. A strait that cannot be reopened because the factions capable of ordering it open have been neutralized. An economic collapse that overtakes the regime faster than any external military operation could. And 4 men from 1988 settling personal scores while the country burns around them. The chaos is real and documented in the contradictory orders being issued daily. The collapse is accelerating along every measurable dimension, and the man with his finger closest to the trigger has no interest in what happens after he pulls it. His name is Vahidi. He has a record stretching from Lebanon to Buenos Aires. He commands the force that fires on tankers while the foreign minister announces peace. When the world asks whether Iran is genuinely coming to the table, it is his calculation more than anyone else's that provides the actual answer. That is what has genuinely stunned every intelligence assessment in Washington. Not the crisis itself, not the fracture lines they always knew existed, but the man at the center of it, what he actually wants, and the terrifying possibility that the chaos unfolding right now is not a crisis he is trying to manage. It is the outcome he chose.